Well, good morning, pushers. As you can tell, there's a few different things going to happen in this lecture, but the purpose of this lecture is going to be to wrap up the last few elements we have in Unit 9. We've got a little bit to take a look at in topics 9.2, 4, 5, and 6. We're going to be looking about the policy debates over the role of the federal government. We're going to talk about economic and technological changes. We're going to talk about domestic and internal migration, and we're going to talk about domestic challenges for the United States in the 21st century. There's quite a bit going on with these topics, but we're going to keep things on a very broad, big picture scale. This may be a little bit more of me just kind of reading through a big overview than a whole lot of specific details, but let's get to it. In class, we had talked about the Reagan conservatism, the Reagan Revolution of the 1980s, and kind of took it into some politics going to the 1990s. When you bring this forward into current times, there are federal policy debates going over well, things that we've already talked about. Free trade agreements, whether it's the NAFTA agreement, North American Free Trade in the 1990s, or the G7 agreements that have been kind of amended and modified going through modern times. There have also been debates about the scope of the government social safety net, probably most notably with the addition of the Affordable Care Act in 2011, so far as Obamacare as an addition to what is an expectation for American citizens. There are also debates over calls to reform the American financial system, especially after the Great Recession in 2008, and maybe a little bit going into modern times when you look at some of the post-COVID economic impacts. There's also federal policy debates over traditional social values and a reduced role for the federal government. Those two last topics are so major that they kind of feed into so many other ways and so many other issues, so far as what, well, people should believe and kind of like what is an acceptable American cultural persona to have or to not have, as the case may be. There are also political and cultural debates that are going on over immigration policies, so more on that on an additional slide coming up, over American diversity and gender roles and family structures, because in a cultural, political, national identity kind of context, the United States has gotten more diverse in so many different ways: ethnic diversity, gender diversity, economic diversity. There's a lot of attention being given to the diversity level of it, and so there's a question about what impact is this going to have on what it means to be an American. But these are debates. These are current questions without answers because they are still being debated. So let's see what we can find if we look at more of the direct economic impacts for this. Just a solid warning, this is going to end up as a very full slide, but I don't know there's a whole lot of specifics that I can or even need to give you on this. The global economy, the US economy, has changed in no small part because of the advent of digital communications. The ability to communicate in a business sense at a moment's notice anywhere in the world is going to lead to increased economic productivity and increased American participation in a globalized economic network. That is the other way to rephrase worldwide economic opportunities. Economic globalism is definitely a thing. This is not possible without the technological innovations that we have known to come and love and take for granted, and that includes computing, digital mobile technology, and the internet, because you can't really have one of those without the other. The fact that we all have personal computers that we walk around with on a daily basis, this is going to transform daily life because of the increased access to information and new social behaviors and social networks. I think you know what I'm talking about on this. You can interact with anybody in the world, and that is seen as being a huge benefit for society, but there are also dangers and threats that go along with it. And now that we start to kind of scratch the surface on artificial intelligence, there's real questions about what this is going to mean, not just but economics, but in politics and social structures as well. throughout the last generation or two, employment has been increasing in service sectors while it has decreased in manufacturing. And this has led to a general decline in union membership. It is interesting that in 2022 and 2023 there have been conversations about the increased presence of union activity in the service sector of the economy, because those are all changes that have happened since the College Board has written this framework. So these changes in employment, it's definitely true. We're much more of a consumer service sector economy than we are a manufacturing economy. That is part of that worldwide economic opportunity that's out there for everybody. There's also the reality that wages have stagnated real wages have stagnated for Americans, specifically in the middle and working class. And there has been a growing sense of economic inequality that has gone on. The sense that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer may not be necessarily always true, but that is a semblance of truth that is out there for a whole lot of Americans, especially when you talk about like the population shifts that are going on for Americans, and that is on the next slide about migration and immigration in modern America. So in talking about these population shifts, the major shift that's gone on is a population shift towards the American South and the American West. We saw this starting back in the late 40s and the 1950s and the 60s with this movement towards the Sun Belt, which is going to have a major population movement into those areas, and kind of southern cities becoming a thing. This is continuing that time period where cities like Houston have seen phenomenal growth over the past 20 or 30 years. This population shift is going to increase the political, economic, and cultural influence of this part of the country. This is true in the Deep South. The populations of the Deep South are a little bit more diverse than they were in previous generations, and there's definitely a movement that's been made towards political equality and economic equality in these areas as well. But just in general across the South, this political influence is key, because as this population shifts there, that is increasing the importance that states like Texas are going to play in influences in the U.S. Congress and the House of Representatives, as well as in the Electoral College when it comes down to presidential elections, which we've talked about in other sections of this unit. So the influence that's there in these areas is strong and it is pronounced, and it is going to be influenced by an increased level of immigration from Latin America and Asia. After immigration law changed in the 1960s to eliminate immigration quotas, migrants coming to the United States from different parts of the world is going to increase dramatically, and this is going to lead to questions about legal or illegal immigration and people that are moving into the country that are going to compete for jobs, and what impact is that going to have on the job market. And the idea, I kind of went out of order on this, and the questions this is going to make about American culture. It's not like we have spent much time in this class talking about Asian or Latin American culture as it influences the United States, but there's more attention to it now than there has been in previous generations. And there's also more attention in other ways in as far as like cultural education, because there are entire courses now that are dedicated to Latin American history and Asian American influences into the United States. So this is another way that you can kind of see an increasing diversity. Just think about it. For the bulk of this course, when we've talked about diversity in America, it has been about white Americans and black Americans, but it's only been in the 20th century that you begin to see any conversation about Asian Americans or Latin America having an influence in the United States. And this is a product of immigration changes that have gone on in the 20th century, but now it's kind of a need to pay more attention to the diversity that's kind of always been there in some aspects in the United States. That's going to impact how things are going to be, well, moving forward for this country. So let's take one last look and take a look at some domestic challenges that the United States are going to have going forward in this century. So we've talked about economic debates and economic changes and migration and immigration debates and changes, but the environmental issue may in fact be the one that is the most impactful for a majority of Americans these days. Through the 70s and 80s and beyond, the conflicts that the United States has been into in the Middle East has kind of helped increase questions about the dependence on fossil fuels and the Earth Day movement, the Green Party movement, going from the 1970s into the early 2000s in the United States, they've kind of consistently raised concerns about climate change. Still, as a fairly controversial topic, so far as like what to do about it, it's taken time for there to be an acceptance that this is an actual scientific process that we might be experiencing. The real debate on this has to do with the American dependence on fossil fuels. That as much as Americans have started a transition to alternate fuel sources, there's a whole lot of economic dependence and economic impact that can come in off of gas and oil prices as it comes down to transportation costs and well, fuel costs for homes and for industry. These debates are going to continue to have an impact on the environment and how it kind of relates to economic consumption moving forward, whether that means electric vehicles or if that means wind and solar energy as alternate fuel sources. These are the changes that we are going to experience in the years or decades to come. And then finally, on the international side of things, with the war on terror and the 2022-2023 conflict between Russia and Ukraine, the United States is still really seen as being the world's leading superpower. That Cold War presence and that nuclear weapons presence that the United States has had since the end of World War II, there's still a heavy influence on this going 80 years beyond the fact. And this is despite there being a consistent trend of economic and foreign policy challenges. The United States may not be the dominant superpower that it has been in a generation or two ago, but it is still one of the dominant forces and maybe the dominant force in the world today. So that's going to wrap this one up for us. Thanks for hanging out and listening, and I'll see you next time.